All right, so today we're going to dive into some pretty heavy stuff, actually. You shared some material with me from Otmar Lindner, and wow, he seems to have some pretty strong opinions about what's happening in the world, with all this geopolitical stuff.
Yeah.
So Lindner describes himself as a former peacekeeper, and he really seems to believe that there are powerful forces, kind of pulling strings behind the scenes. He even goes as far as saying there's this deep state that's like manipulating global events. Have you ever heard of this before, this deep state
Oh
thing?
yeah, the deep state, it's a concept that comes up a lot, especially in groups that are kind of skeptical of the mainstream narrative.
Hmm.
It's basically this idea that there's this hidden network of people, maybe within governments or, other powerful organizations, and they're working to advance their own agenda regardless of, what's good for the rest of us.
So Linder claims that this deep state has stolen, trillions from taxpayers. That's a pretty big claim.
It is.
What do you think about that?
Well, it's definitely a serious accusation, but it's important to remember that he's speculating here. Lindner doesn't really provide any concrete evidence to back up that number, trillions. That said, his claim does highlight, I think, a broader trend. We're seeing, a growing distrust of financial institutions and how governments are handling money.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way,
Right.
especially when you see things like financial crises or, stories about government waste. It's easy to think like something's going on that we don't know about.
Yeah, definitely.
So Linder doesn't just stop with finances, though. He actually connects this deep state idea to a bunch of other hot button issues:
Okay.
COVID-19, climate change, geoengineering, even philanthropy. It's like everything's connected to this shadowy group.
It's interesting how he makes those connections. He's basically weaving this narrative where everything is part of like a bigger plan orchestrated by this deep state. It's kind of a pattern we see. It's conspiracy theories, right? Finding connections and patterns where others might not see them.
Yeah, and then he throws around this term psyops,
Oh, yeah.
which sounds like something out of a spy movie. What does he mean by psyops?
Yeah, so he's talking about psychological operations, which, are methods of influencing people's thoughts and behaviors through things like propaganda and disinformation. So basically, Lindner is saying that the deep state uses these psyops to discredit anyone who questions their narrative or tries to expose the truth as they see it.
So it's like if you believe Linder's view, then you're basically seeing the world through this lens of constant manipulation.
Right. It's like everything's a trick.
Yeah.
And that can be really appealing to some people, especially those who, feel like they don't have a voice or that their concerns are being ignored. It can be empowering to think that you're seeing through the illusions and understanding what's really happening.
Okay, so let's talk about one of the biggest examples that Lindner uses to support his arguments:
Okay.
the war in Ukraine. He's saying that the U.S. basically instigated the war for its own benefit and is now abandoning Ukraine.
Yeah, this is where we really see Lindner's perspective diverging from the mainstream narrative. Most experts agree that the war started with Russia's invasion, right? And that was a clear violation of international law. But Lindner's presenting a completely different interpretation. He's suggesting that the U.S. provoked Russia somehow and is using the conflict to further its own agenda.
And he even includes this quote from a German source.
Yeah.
And it's pretty intense. It accuses German politicians of having blood on their hands because they supported the war effort.
Right. That quote is definitely using some strong language, and it reflects this deep anger and frustration with how Germany has handled the situation. But it's interesting because, while this German perspective is criticizing Western involvement, it doesn't necessarily buy into Linder's whole deep state narrative. It's more about, the failures of German leadership specifically.
So we've got these three drastically different views on the war in Ukraine: the mainstream narrative, Lindner's take, and then this German perspective that's critical of the West but doesn't fully align with either one. So how do we even start to make sense of this?
That's the question, right? We're constantly bombarded with information from so many sources, and it's hard to sort through what's credible and what's not. I think the best thing we can do is, look at the evidence that's being presented, consider the potential biases of the sources, and then think critically about the arguments being made.
Lindner's really passionate about getting this message out. He talks about building a movement of truth seekers to challenge the deep state and expose what he believes is the real story.
Right. And, he's definitely tapping into that feeling we talked about earlier, that feeling that people are being manipulated and need to wake up to the truth. And his language is really geared toward those who feel disillusioned or distrustful of mainstream institutions.
It's almost like he sees himself as this lone wolf, fighting against these powerful forces who are trying to silence him. That's a pretty compelling image, especially today when there's so much information flying around it's hard to know what we believe.
It is, and that's exactly why it's so important to be media literate, to be able to look at information critically and not just accept things at face value.
Wow, this is a lot to take in. I'm definitely going to need to do some more thinking about this. Linder's ideas are really provocative, and I'm curious to see where else he takes this whole thing.
Yeah, let's keep going with this. It looks like he gets into some more specifics about his concerns and what he wants to do about it.
All right, let's hear it. It seems like Lindner is especially worried about how, the stories around global crises, like COVID-19 and climate change, are being shaped. He thinks they're being used by this deep state to kind of like control people through fear.
Yeah, that makes sense. If we think back to what we were talking about earlier, we're seeing this, growing skepticism and distrust towards what's being reported by, mainstream media and governments. And that's creating an environment where these alternative explanations, like what Lindner's putting forward, can really gain traction.
I mean, it's interesting because his, deep state theory, it might seem pretty out there to some people, but his concerns about information being manipulated and trust eroding in institutions, that's something that I think resonates with a lot of people.
It does. It's a big issue. Even if you don't buy into the whole deep state thing, I think a lot of people are worried about, who's controlling the information we see and how that, impacts our understanding of the world.
Lindner even goes further and he calls out woke politics specifically as something he thinks is going to end soon. What do you think he means by that?
Yeah, woke, that's a loaded term these days, right? I mean, it's often used to kind of dismiss progressive movements and ideas. So by using it, Lindner is tapping into, this cultural clash that we're seeing all over the world right now.
It's like he's siding with people who feel like traditional values and ways of life are being attacked. He's like a champion for the people who feel left behind.
Exactly. And that kind of talk can be very powerful because it speaks to that, sense of loss and anxiety that people feel when society is changing so quickly.
Another thing I thought was pretty bold was him calling philanthropy a hoax. I mean, sure, there are some criticisms, about how some of these philanthropic efforts work, but to write off the whole thing like that seems extreme.
It does. It makes you wonder what happened to him, what experiences led him to that conclusion. I mean, there have definitely been cases where philanthropy has been misused. Sometimes it's more about, someone's image than actually helping people.
Maybe he's seen that firsthand and now he's, generalizing and thinking all philanthropy is just selfish.
It's possible. He's like completely lost faith in the idea that, you know, wealthy and powerful people can actually want to make a positive difference in the world.
So what's Lindner's plan? He's obviously not just going to, sit back and watch all this happen.
He's not. He's actually very clear about what he wants to do. He wants people to, make the truth known. He wants people to do their own research.
Yeah, we hear that a lot these days. Do your own research. It sounds good, be inquisitive, but often it leads people down these rabbit holes online.
Yeah, that's the problem. It's one thing to be curious and ask questions, but it's another to just completely reject credible sources of information and only look for things that confirm your existing beliefs.
Lindner specifically mentions wanting to collaborate with others who are, trying to get the truth out. He even talks about maybe forming a think tank.
It sounds like he's trying to build a network of like-minded people, to support each other and reinforce their views. And that can create, this sense of community and belonging, which I think is especially appealing to people who feel like they're on the outside.
Yeah, like they're building their own world where their version of the truth is the dominant one.
Exactly. And that can be dangerous because if you're only surrounded by people who agree with you, then it's really hard to challenge your own beliefs.
It's kind of ironic that he's launching this whole movement through a podcast.
Is it?
I mean, it seems like a very deliberate choice.
It is interesting. Podcasts are so popular now. It's how people connect and share ideas. And there's this intimacy and authenticity to them that can be really appealing, especially to people who, don't trust traditional media.
It lets him bypass the, mainstream media gatekeepers and speak directly to his audience.
Exactly. He even says his podcast is, a platform dedicated to truth, transparency, and the future of our world. So he's presenting himself as this, brave truth teller fighting against powerful forces.
He mentions his experience as a peacekeeper, being in the field, in the heart of conflicts, witnessing firsthand the realities that are hidden from the public. I could see how that kind of experience would make someone skeptical.
Oh, definitely. And it gives his message a certain authority. He's not just, some random guy with an opinion. He's someone who's been there, seen things firsthand, and come to his own conclusions.
He even talks about how disillusioned he became with his peacekeeping work. Like he started to see these patterns of, manipulation and control, and it challenged everything he thought he knew.
It's a common thing with conspiracy theories, right? Like this waking up to a hidden reality, realizing that things aren't what they seem.
Like he said, I used to be one of them, but now I see the truth. And that's a powerful message for people who are already questioning things. He even uses this phrase, today I no longer wear the uniform, but I remain a soldier of truth. So he's still fighting, but now it's a battle for information.
Wow. That's powerful. He's taking his experience, his authority from his military background and applying it to this new mission.
It's like he's describing this world where governments and the elites are orchestrating these crises to, get what they want. The media's in on it. And anyone who speaks out gets silenced.
It's a classic conspiracy theory, this idea that there's this, powerful, shadowy group controlling everything.
It's very black and white. But I can see why it would appeal to people who are feeling disillusioned and powerless.
Yeah, it gives them a sense of, clarity, like a way to make sense of all the chaos and complexity.
He talks about trillions of dollars being stolen from everyday people, under false pretenses. It taps into this feeling of economic injustice that I think a lot of people feel.
It does. It's a powerful message, especially for those who are struggling financially or who feel like the system is rigged against them.
He keeps saying we've been lied to, and he wants his listeners to see through the deception.
It's like he's saying, don't trust anyone but me. I'm the only one telling the truth.
And he even says that things are changing, that people are waking up and starting to see through the lies.
Right. So it's a message of hope, like his movement's gaining momentum and the truth is going to win in the end.
Okay, so how does he connect all of this to the war in Ukraine?
He uses it as like the perfect example of the manipulation he's talking about. He calls it one of the most tragic examples of this manipulation. And he claims that, it was instigated, funded, and prolonged by Western interests.
So he's blaming the U.S. and its allies for the war instead of Russia.
Exactly. And he's playing into this distrust of Western foreign policy, like this idea that the U.S. is always interfering in other countries and starting wars for its own benefit.
He says that the U.S. shifting its focus and, stepping away from Ukraine is proof that the brutal truth is coming to light.
Like he's saying, see, they're abandoning Ukraine now because they got what they wanted. They never really cared about helping the Ukrainian people.
He uses some really strong language to describe the war. He talks about hundreds of thousands of young men being sent to die in a war they could never win, and billions of taxpayer dollars being funneled into a war that was never meant to end in victory.
It's emotional. It's supposed to make people feel angry and betrayed. It feeds into this idea that, the elites are sacrificing regular people for their own gain.
And then he says peace was never the goal, control was.
Wow. That's pretty cynical, but it fits with his whole narrative of the deep state.
Like he's saying the war in Ukraine is just another part of their plan, for world domination.
And he uses this example to, really drive home his point that people need to wake up and take control of the narrative. He's saying that if we don't challenge, the accepted view of things and create our own platforms for truth, then this manipulation is just going to keep happening.
It's like he's saying, don't trust the media, don't trust the government, trust me.
Yeah, he's the alternative, the one source of truth.
So who's he trying to reach with this message?
He describes his movement as a united front for truth. And he wants bloggers, YouTubers, independent journalists, scientists, free thinkers, and everyday citizens, anyone who is ready to take a stand.
So everyone, basically.
He's casting a wide net.
And he calls out influencers, people with big followings. He knows that social media is powerful.
Oh, yeah, he's definitely using the internet to his advantage.
He lays out his goals, too. He wants to expose the real motives behind, world events. He wants uncensored discussions and analysis. He wants to connect with experts, whistleblowers, and independent researchers. And he wants people to do their own research.
He wants it all.
It's interesting, though, how he keeps saying that this isn't about pushing a political ideology or, creating another controlled movement.
He wants to separate himself from, any political party. Like, he's above politics.
Like, this is bigger than politics. This is about truth and justice.
Exactly. And that can be really effective at uniting people from different backgrounds.
Lindner even tells people exactly where to go to join him, his Telegram channel.
Oh, wow, that's interesting. Telegram's known for its privacy, and it's popular with groups that promote, alternative viewpoints.
So he's creating a space where his followers can connect without, outside interference.
Right. It's a safe space for his narrative to grow.
And he doesn't just invite people to join. He tells them to, share this invitation with your network and invite everyone who is ready to fight for truth and justice.
He's building an army
of truth seekers.
to fight the system.
And he ends his message with this, hopeful tone. He says, let's work together to expose the lies and create solutions for a better world.
So inspiring. It makes you want to get involved.
It's been really interesting, going through Linder's ideas and seeing how he puts together this whole story about, manipulation and control and the need for this movement to expose the truth.
Yeah, it's a reminder that we live in a world where information is constantly being, fought over and shaped by different agendas. And it's really important to be able to think critically about what we see and hear and to be aware of the biases of the people who are sharing it.
That's a good point. So what's next?
Well, it looks like Lindner finishes off by talking about some potential solutions to all of this.
Okay, let's hear it. So Lindner ends by talking about, solutions. He says that the only way to fight this deep state is to, create a new system, one that's based on truth and transparency.
Right. And he sees technology as like a key part of this, like using blockchain and things like that to, create a more decentralized and transparent world.
Yeah, he talks about, this idea of a parallel society, like building alternative institutions and systems that are outside the control of the deep state.
Which is interesting, right? Because on the one hand, it's like empowering, taking control, but on the other hand, it's kind of like retreating from the world, giving up on trying to fix the existing systems.
It seems like he's really pushing this idea of individual responsibility, too. Like, it's up to each of us to wake up, do our own research, and, spread the truth.
Definitely. And he even provides like a list of things that people can do, things like supporting independent media, boycotting corporations that are, aligned with the deep state, things like that.
It's a pretty radical agenda.
It is, I mean, it's like he's calling for a complete overhaul of society.
So what do you think? Is Linder onto something? Is there really a deep state controlling everything? Or is this just, another conspiracy theory?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to be critical of those in power and to question the narratives that we're being told. But I also think it's important to be careful about, jumping to conclusions and seeing conspiracies everywhere.
Yeah, it's like finding that balance, right, between skepticism and, just accepting everything you hear.
Exactly. And I think it's important to remember that the world is complex. There's rarely, a single explanation for why things happen. It's usually a combination of factors.
It's definitely been a thought-provoking deep dive. Linder's ideas are definitely out there. But they do raise some important questions about, the nature of power and information in the world today.
They do. And I think regardless of whether you agree with him or not, it's valuable to, engage with these ideas and to think critically about what we believe and why we believe it.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks for sharing your insights with us.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next time with another thought-provoking topic.